Okay, last time I introduced you to the covariation calculus for causal attribution, which is a general framework for that people seem to use to try to figure out what caused what in the social domain. And I also introduced you to a set of causal schemata that people also use to try to figure out what causes what in the social domain. The general idea behind the covariation calculus is that when we have the opportunity to observe the same behavior occurring over a number of different instances, we do something like what a scientist does, which is try to assign causality to various factors based on the information available to us. Information that is plotted out in terms of consistency, the consistency of the actor's behavior towards the target, the distinctiveness of the actor's behavior towards the target, and the consensus of other actors in their behavior towards the target. And the general idea here is that various patterns of consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information will drive causal attributions toward the actor, toward the target, toward the context, or whatever. Often, however, we have to make causal attributions where we don't have all the information available to us, when we only have a single observation. Under those circumstances, Kelly and others argued we fall back on kind of shortcuts, which Kelly called causal schemata. That is to say, Kelly argued that we have theories of causality in various domains, and we use that knowledge, or rather those beliefs about what causes what, in order to fill in missing information. So that if we know, for example, that John's not very smart, but he passed the test, but he got into a great college, we know, we have a theory that says, well, you get into a great college either because you're very smart or because you're very rich. He wasn't very smart, so he must have gotten into college because he was very rich. So we apply the theory to try to reason through and figure out why things happened the way they did. What I want to focus on today is another set of schemata that we use to make inferences about causality. Very interesting set that's generally ignored in the social psychological literature, but has gotten some attention in the cognitive science literature because it's a set of schemata that come out of language. This is one of the few times I actually get to talk about language in this course, and I hope I get it right. Here is the basic phenomenon. This is from a study by Alfonso Karamazza, problem of anaphoric reference. So if I tell you Jane hit Mary because she had stolen a tennis racket, and then I ask you, what does the pronoun she refer to? That's the problem of anaphoric reference in linguistics. What do you say it refers to? Jane, right? Okay. Or does it refer to Jane, or does it refer to Mary? Yeah, it refers to Mary, okay? Because, well, we'll figure out why that is. Now take almost the exact same sentence. Jane angered Mary because she had stolen the tennis racket. And I ask you what the she refers to. And it refers to Jane. Okay, there's very wide agreement about that. What's interesting is these are very, very, very similar sentences. Jane hit Mary because she had stolen a tennis racket. Jane angered Mary because she had stolen a tennis racket. But the causal attribution is quite different in the two cases. In the first case, Jane hit Mary because of something Mary did. In the second case, Jane angered Mary because of something Jane did. You've got to figure out why that's the case. Why does the causal attribution go in one direction in the one case and in the opposite direction in the other case? Roger Brown, who was both a social psychologist and a linguist, took up this problem at one point and performed a very interesting study that I want to share with you for the bulk of today, in which he tried to analyze exactly what's going on in these kinds of patterns of causal attribution. And he began just the way he did. Consider the following statement: Ted helps Paul. That's all you know. Okay? Ted helps Paul. And the question is, why does Ted do this? Does Ted do this because he's the kind of person who helps people? Or does he do this because Paul is the kind of person whom people help? Or is there some other reason? And the result is 3/4 of the subjects who are posed the sentence make the attribution to Ted, that Ted helps Paul because Ted is the kind of person who helps people. Nobody, not a single person in the study, made the attribution to Paul. The remaining 5 subjects made the attribution to some other reason, which is a choice that they had. This is quite a general effect. If you take a sentence frame like Ted verbs Paul, and you fill in the verb with any of a large number of verbs, Ted helps Paul, Ted cheats Paul, Ted competes with Paul, Ted criticizes Paul, and you ask people, why did this happen? What subjects will tend to do is to say it's because of something about Ted, not something about Paul. They'll prefer to make causal attribution to the subject of the sentence rather than to the object of the sentence. And as you can see, that's quite a large and consistent result. So you might say, well, okay, what happens is a causal attribution seems to be biased towards the subject of the sentence. Ted helps Paul. Why? The subject verb the object. Why? Because of something about the subject. But it turns out not always to be the case. Consider the following statement: Ted likes Paul. You ask people why that is. Does Ted like Paul because Ted's the kind of person who likes people? Does Ted like Paul because Paul's the kind of person whom people like? Or is there some other reason? And what you find when you do the study, as Brown and Deborah Fish did, is that the majority of subjects will make the attribution now to Paul, okay? Some subjects will now make the attribution to Ted, but the overwhelming, the bulk of the attributions are made to Ted, rather to Paul. And again, this is a fairly common result. You can take a sentence frame like Ted verbs Paul and fill in the verb with any one of a number of verbs, and what you get is subjects making the causal attribution to the object of the sentence, not the subject of the sentence. So a simple conclusion that causal attribution is biased towards the linguistic subject won't work in this case. Just so that you see, again, quite a nice result here. Ted X's Paul, where X equals charms, the attribution is to Ted. Ted charms Paul. Why? Because of something about Ted. But when X equals loathes, Ted loathes Paul, the attribution is to Paul rather than to Ted. So we get attribution to the grammatical subject or the grammatical object. Okay, so it can't just be a simple matter of making causal attributions toward the subject of the sentence. Yeah? No, nobody's done that. And I think when we get to the end of this, you'll see why, but that would be a very interesting kind of control condition to do. What happens when you don't know what the verb is, all right, and see what people do. That would be a nice little study. Nobody's done that to my knowledge. Okay. Brown's insight was that causal attribution does not go with the linguistic subject or the linguistic object, but rather has something to do with what Brown and other linguists call, shall we take a minute and shut the windows, or are you going to be too hot? Do you think we can even shut the windows? The answer is no. There you go. Thanks. We'll see how that works. When the temperature in the room gets above 97 degrees, let me know. Okay, so, here's what seems to be happening here. What did I do with that? Oh, there we go, thank you. Okay, so you've got a word, you've got a verb like helps, okay, and there are adjectives that are derived from this verb, and in this case, the adjective derived from help is a word like helpful. And if you think about it for a second, helpful is, in this sense, in this case, an adjective that's attributed to the subject of the sentence. Ted helps Paul. Helpful is the derived adjective. Okay, that's the characteristic trait. And who's helpful? It's Ted that's helpful. Ted likes Paul. The derived adjective is likable. And in this case, the derived adjective is attributed to the object of the sentence. Ted likes Paul. Why? Because Paul is likable. Same thing goes with charms and loathes. Charming is the adjective derived from the verb charm, and that's an adjective that's attributed to the subject of the sentence. And loathsome, okay, is the derived adjective from loathe, and that's something that's attributed to the object. So that's kind of interesting, okay. So Brown then considers this possibility, okay, that this is basically a syntax effect, that greater causal weight is given to the grammatical subject of a sentence or the grammatical object of a sentence, depending on whether the adjective derived from the verb is attributed to the subject or the object. If the derived adjective is attributed to the subject, we attribute causality to the subject. If the derived adjective is attributed to the object, we attribute it to the object. And, okay, that works, or at least it works so far, but Brown argues, well, that's fine, except for one small detail. In order to make causal attributions, what you'd have to do is consult the dictionary every time to find out what the derived adjective is, right? And that's probably not how we do it either, right? There's got to be something better than that. And the solution that Brown comes up with is that this isn't exactly a syntactic effect, it's more of a semantic effect. And here, Brown bases his analysis on the work of Charles Fillmore, who was for many years a linguist here at the University of California, Berkeley. He's still here, but he's retired now. Some of you who in linguistics department remember that we celebrated a big anniversary for him last year. And Fillmore proposed that that subjects and objects are not what's really important about a sentence. What's really important about subjects and objects in a sentence is not that they're subjects or objects, but rather the role they take in the sentence. And he argues that there are two sets of such roles that people take. Either the agent-patient role, which is what you see in Ted helps Paul, where Ted is the agent of the helping. He's the one who's doing the helping. And Paul is the patient of the helping. He's the one who's getting helped. And Fillmore argued that this role of agent or patient is what you get when you're dealing with behavioral action verbs, verbs like helping, or for that matter, hitting, where the agent causes or instigates some action, and the patient is the recipient of the action that the agent causes or instigates. The other set of semantic roles Fillmore identified is what he calls stimulus and experiencer, and it applies to sentences like Ted likes Paul, which don't involve behavioral action verbs, but rather involve mental state verbs, the mental state of liking someone. And here, the idea is that there is a stimulus which gives rise to a certain experience, and then there is an experiencer that has that experience. Okay, so that's the basic idea here. Now, Fillmore and Brown pointed out that when you're in the agent-patient mode, agents almost always take the subject role, okay? Yes, we're capable of saying in English, Paul was helped by Ted, okay? But really, usually, we think about agents taking the subject role as in the simple sentence, Ted helps Paul. It says, look, adjectives that are derived from action verbs are attributive to the agent, not the patient. Okay, that's the general hypothesis here. So if you have an action verb, if you look at all the adjectives that are derived from action verbs, they tend to be attributive to the agent, not the patient. Remember, it's not the subject versus object. That's quite a different kind of thing. Similarly, in stimulus and experiencer, he argued that both the stimulus and the experiencer can share the subject role. So you can have Ted attracts Paul. Paul is the person who's experiencing the attraction, or you can have Ted detests Paul, where Ted is the person who's experiencing the detesting. Okay, but it turns out that adjectives derived from state verbs are not attributed to the subject or the object. What happens is that adjectives derived from mental state verbs are attributive to the stimulus, not to the experiencer. Okay, so adjectives derived from action verbs are attributive to the agent, not the patient, and they drive causal attributions to the agent. Adjectives derived from mental state verbs are attributive to the stimulus, not the experiencer, and they drive causal attribution to the stimulus, not the experiencer. Okay? So that leads Brown to propose that we employ, in addition to whatever other things we use to employ causal attributions, we carry around on our heads what he called a set of linguistic schemata that weight our attributions to causality. And so first, we have this agent-patient schema, and he notes that adjectives derived from action verbs tend to be attributive to the agent, not the patient. He actually goes through an unabridged dictionary and finds that the actual ratio is 18 to 1. Okay? There's for every 18 action verbs that are attributive to the agent, there's only one action verb where the derived adjective is attributive to the patient. Okay? So that agent-patient schema is going to give greater causal weight to the agent, not the patient. That's the general idea. This is something that's built into language. Okay? Then there is what Brown calls the stimulus-experiencer schema, and he notes that adjectives derived from state verbs are overwhelmingly attributive to the stimulus, not the experiencer. Again, if you go into an unabridged dictionary, which Brown did, well, actually Deborah Fish did it. That's why we have graduate students. You find that the ratio is 14 to 1. And Brown's argument is that this linguistic fact gives greater causal weight to the stimulus, not to the experiencer. Okay, so then again, the idea here is that whenever you hear or see or you're dealing with a behavioral action verb, the behavioral action verb will invoke the agent-patient schema. The agent is usually the subject, as it is in the case of Ted cheats Paul, but whether the agent is the subject or not, you're going to think that causality resides with the agent. Whenever you deal with a mental state verb, Brown argues that you invoke what he calls the stimulus-experiencer schema, and whether the stimulus is the subject, as it is in Ted charms Paul, or whether the experiencer is, or whether the experiencer is the subject, as in Ted loathes Paul, it's not going to go to the subject, it's going to go to the experiencer. Causal attribution is going to go to the experimenter. So that's exactly what led to Brown and Fish's experiment, okay? So they take simple sentences like Ted likes Paul, you don't have any other information. No consensus information, no distinctiveness information, no consistency information, no nothing, just presented with very simple-minded sentences like this. And then they ask people, how likely is it that this occurred because Ted is the kind of person who likes people, or Paul is the kind of person that people like. And just to give people the feeling that they have some choice here, they had these ratings on a 1 to 9 scale. Here's a list of agent-patient verbs. Ted verbs Paul. These are all sentences of the form Ted helps Paul, where there's an action verb: flatter, harm, help, disobey, competes with, or whatever. And then they used a set of stimulus experiencer verbs like astonish and exasperate and enjoy and esteem and honor. And if you think about it for a second, words, mental state verbs like astonish and attract, when you plug them into a sentence, you get what Brown and Fish call the stimulus experiencer form, where Ted charms Paul. Paul is the experiencer of the charming, okay? But over here, if it's dread or enjoy or esteem, this is what's known as the experiencer stimulus form, where the subject is the sentence is the experimenter. Ted likes Paul. Ted is the person who experiences the liking. So what they did was they presented these sentences to subjects in the active voice, okay? And then, so this is action verbs like helps, mental state verbs like charms, and the other class of mental states like likes. And what they were able to do is to predict very nicely where people would make the causal attribution. If it's an action verb like helps, causal attribution overwhelmingly goes to the agent. If it's a mental state verb like charms, and the stimulus is the subject of the sentence, the attribution goes to the stimulus. If it's a mental state verb like likes, where the experiencer is the subject of the sentence, the mental state goes to, again, to the stimulus. So that's a very, very, very nice pattern of results. First question that should come to mind is, what happens if you word these sentences in the passive voice? Ted is helped by Paul, or Ted is liked by Paul, or whatever, and you get exactly the same result. This isn't a matter of active voice versus passive voice. Whether you word these sentences actively or passively, you get exactly the same kind of effect. It's very, very, very nice. And again, this is one of these experiments where you just kill for results like this. And they kept doing variants. So, for example, in another experiment, they used, instead of forcing people to rate causal weightings, they simply asked people to freely list causes. So they say, Ted likes Paul, why? Okay, and then did people say, well, it's because Ted does something, or is it because Paul something? They only allowed subjects to write about one of the characters, okay, but that's the whole idea of the experiment. And again, you get this very nice result where even in a free listing experiment where you're not holding a gun to subjects' heads and forcing them to choose the subject or the object, with action verbs, the attribution goes to the agent. With the mental state verbs of the two forms, the attribution always goes to the stimulus. So again, that looks pretty good, okay? So Brown and Fish argued that we have in our heads a set of what they call linguistic schemata, where behavioral action verbs invoke the agent-patient schema, which drives attributions to the agent. Mental state verbs invoke the stimulus experiencer schema, which drives attributions to the stimulus, regardless of whether the verb is one of these forms as the other. Okay, so, that's the basic finding. Especially those of you who are cognitive science majors and you've gotten through CogSci 101, the next question you want to ask yourself is this a Whorfian result? Okay? Do we have here a case where the structure of language is constraining our thoughts? You'll remember that Edward Sapir and his student, the Benjamin Whorf, We're very interested in the relationship between thought and language. One way to think about the relationship between thought and language is that language expresses our thoughts, allows us to communicate our thoughts to other people. Another idea, which is what Sapir and Worf had in mind, was that our thought is structured or controlled by language in various ways. There are strong forms of the Worfian hypothesis. There are weak forms of the Worfian hypothesis. But both forms basically argue that thought is subservient to language and that the structure of language structures our thought. Those of you who aren't familiar with this is the old idea that, you know, Eskimos have 57 words for snow, and that the availability of all these snow-describing words in their language shapes their thinking about snow. Turns out it's not true. Eskimos don't have 57 words for snow, and if you're a downhill skier, you have 57 words for snow. So their examples were actually pretty bad, but the idea has had enormous longevity. Actually, there are battles in linguistics conferences about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and there are whole departments of linguistics that split down the center on this topic. I've trained in the East Coast. In the East Coast, nobody thinks the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis makes any sense at all. If you're trained at MIT or University of Pennsylvania or other places, they don't have any time for this. West Coast universities tend to take it more seriously. Berkeley is a hotbed of this stuff, and there's probably something to it. But it turns out this isn't an example, and it's an interesting example, and it's not an example of the Worfian hypothesis for really interesting reasons. Okay, first, let's get to the actual Worfian argument. Okay, the idea here is that our language is structured in such a way that some verbs are related to certain adjectives that are attributive to the agent or the patient or the stimulus or experiencer. This is a feature of our language, and it's that feature of our language that leads us to think the way we do. That's the Worfian interpretation of this whole thing, okay? So if I say Ted helps Paul, why did that happen? You say it's because of something about Ted, because the derived adjective helpful is attributed to the agent, and that leads you to think that this happened because of something like Ted. But if you think about it for another half a second, you see that that can't be right. Yes, helpful is attributive to the agent, and charming is attributive to the stimulus, and likable is attributive to the stimulus, and loathsome is attributive to the stimulus, and that's true. But there's nothing about the structure of English as a language that really requires this. Brown and Fish argue that we've got a lot of ways of deriving adjectives from verbs in English. There are a bunch of suffixes here. This is pretty much an exhaustive list of the suffixes that we add to verbs in English to derive adjectives from them. Help, helpful, rely, reliant, aggress, aggressive, loathe, loathsome, and so on and so forth. You can make up all the adjectives that you want. And the point is that you can add these suffixes to any verb you want. Okay? There's nothing about language there's nothing about the English language that really constrains which of these suffixes you're going to add to a verb to create various adjectives. So, for example, you could just as easily have in English a derived adjective help-worthy that's attributive to the patient, not to the agent. That's a perfectly good English word. It's not in the dictionary, but it's a perfectly good English word. Ted charms Paul. You could have a derived adjective charmable that's attributive to the experiencer. Perfectly good. We have other kinds of able words. We just don't happen to have charmable, okay? Ted likes Paul. We could have an adjective called likeful, okay? That's attributive to the experiencer. So Ted likes Paul because Paul's likeful, right? Or Ted's likeful, right? Or we have Ted loathes Paul, okay? Not because Paul is loathsome, but because Ted is loathful. Is somebody who's full of loathing. Now again, we don't have these words in English, but now that I've pointed out the possibility to you, you will go home tonight and start using words like this, okay? Guaranteed. He's a very loathful person, meaning he loathes a lot of, meaning that he loathes a lot of people. Okay, so the point here is that there's nothing about English as a language that constrains our way of thinking. Rather, Brown and Fish argue that we have chosen various derived adjectives because that's the way we think. This is not a Worfian result. In fact, it is probably a contra-Worfian result. Okay, so English has the ability to create derived adjectives that are attributable to either party, to the stimulus or the experiencer, to the agent or the patient. It just doesn't do it. In English, we tend to have derived adjectives that are attributive to the agent rather than the patient by a ratio of about 18:1, and we tend to have derived adjectives that are attributive to the stimulus rather than the experiencer by a ratio of about 14:1. And Brown and Fish argue that the reason we do this to language is because we think this way. Thought is constraining language, not the other way around. The reason we don't have verbs, adjectives like helpable, okay, or loathful is because we don't think that way, okay. So we just haven't derived the right kind of language. So here you have another set of principles, another set of rules that seem to shape the causal attributions we make. Something that is not entertained by the covariation calculus, something that goes beyond the kinds of concrete causal theories that are reflected in what Kelly calls the causal schemata. But here we do have something about language that seems to reflect how we think about causation. When we think about actions, we tend to think about the agent, not the patient, as being responsible for these things. When we think about mental states, we tend to think about the stimulus rather than the experiencer as being responsible for these things. Okay? So that's the general idea. And I just think this is a great result. Usually in social cognition, when we talk about language, all we can really talk about is the 17,954 adjectives we have in English for discriminating between people in terms of their behavioral traits or their mental states or something like that. Here you've got something closer to real language, okay? Something that a linguist would actually identify as being a linguistically interesting proposition. And it's, of course, what's very interesting about it is that the whole basis for this comes from Charles Fillmore, who is our colleague and teacher here at Berkeley. Okay. Yes? Mm-hmm. Well, there might very well be a recursive relationship, okay? It might very well be that we think about this, and so we constructed our language in a particular way, and the language reinforces the way we think. You could probably save the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in this instance that way. But in the end, well, certainly Sapir and Whorf didn't think about this as a recursive way of thinking about it. They thought about this as language, the structure of language causing thought to be structured in a particular way. The idea that these things feed on each other, I think, is seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's just what's interesting about it is that over the 1,000 years of the evolution of English, it has not evolved words like trustful, but it has evolved words like trustworthy, okay, and things like that. So, I mean, it's just not something that's happened, okay? So here, if you want to think about which came first, if you want to play the chicken and the egg problem here, it turns out not to be anything about English as a language that forces us to think this way. It seems to be that we've selected our language to express the thoughts we've got, all right? So that's the kind of battle that's being waged here. Me, well, you know me, I like things that go in circles, right? So your alternative is one that appeals to me a great deal. I don't know how we would test that except maybe through the procedures of something like historical linguistics. You know, I just don't know how we do that. Maybe we could come up with an artificial language. If somebody wanted to kind of start making up nonsense verbs, you know, it might be very interesting to attach various suffixes to them and see what happens. I mean, so you can imagine, you know, taking this and kind of playing with it and doing all sorts of interesting experiments. This is a result that has not gotten as much attention, I think, in the social cognitive literature as I think it should have, mostly because social psychologists tend not to talk to linguists, right? It's just one of those things about disciplinary boundaries. Anything else on this before I go on? I want to talk about just a couple of other phenomena today. Okay. There we go. Let's go back to the covariation calculus for a moment and just kind of remind you that the idea behind the covariation calculus is that when we're supplied with all the information that we need, information about consistency and distinctiveness and consensus, then we use that information, we plug it into a calculus, plug it into essentially a formula that will, in the manner of scientific reasoning, give us an attribution to the actor or the target or the context or something like that. The covariation calculus is one of a class of theories about social behavior and, for that matter, social cognition that usually gets subsumed under the label of normative rationality. Kelly begins precisely with the idea that the everyday person in the ordinary course of everyday living is behaving like a naive scientist who designs controlled experiments and takes account of confounding variables and does something like a statistical analysis of the data so you can find out whether an effect is varying with the target or the actor or the context or whatever, and then comes to logical conclusions about, in this case, what causes what, given various kinds of premises. The covariation calculus is a precisely rational way of going about making causal attributions. If you were going to design a creature from the beginning to engage in causal explanation, you'd build in something like this formula with it. It is, in fact, an algorithm. It is a procedure that is guaranteed to give the correct results if you apply it properly. And when you think about the output of the covariation calculus, it's exactly the way you'd think it ought to work. However, it turns out that there are lots of problems with this idea that when we think and reason, we apply algorithms. You're all familiar with these, I think, probably from your earlier courses, but sometimes we don't know what the algorithm is. Sometimes we don't have all the information available. Sometimes we can't use all the information for various kinds of reasons. These are circumstances that are often called by the psychologists like Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky conditions of judgment under uncertainty. And it's very clear now that when we don't have enough information to apply the covariation calculus, we do fall back on various kinds of other procedures that depart from the covariation calculus. We employ causal schemata of various kinds as Kelly talked about in our last lecture, we employ linguistic schemata of various kinds as a kind of shortcut to help us make these kinds of causal attributions. It turns out, though, that even when people have all the information they need, they still depart in systematic ways from what they should do given the covariation calculus. And there are three phenomena of causal attribution that have gotten a fair amount of attention in the social psychological literature, mistakes that people make despite the fact that there's plenty of information available to them. These are first known as the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error consists of overestimating the role of personal factors like trait dispositions in causing behavior and underestimating the role of environmental factors like situational constraints and things like that. So put briefly, in the fundamental attribution error, we tend to attribute a person's behavior to the person rather than the situation. The actor-observer difference is derived from that. We do tend, we do tend to make dispositional attributions about other people, but we tend to make situational attributions about ourselves. And then a self-serving bias in causal attribution in which, when we're talking about the outcomes of our own behavior, we tend to take responsibility for good outcomes and tend to deny or deflect responsibility for bad outcomes. Quick demonstrations of each of these. Okay, there's the fundamental attribution error. This is an experiment, classic experiment in social psychology on what's known as attitude attribution by Edward Jones. Subjects were simply asked to read essays on various topics and then make inferences from the essays about what the authors of the essays really believed. You do this all the time. You read an op-ed piece in the newspaper, and when you talk about it to your roommates over breakfast, you say, David Brooks believes this, or Paul Krugman thinks that, or whatever. You infer the writer's underlying attitudes from what he says. Okay. However, in one condition of the experiment, the subjects were told that the authors of the essays had a choice in what they would do, what they'd write about, and in the other half of the authors, the subjects were told that the authors had no choice, that they were assigned the topic and they were assigned the point of view. Those of you who have ever had any experience with debating know that this is very common in debating. You're very often put in the position of making a case that you don't actually believe in, okay, because that's the topic that's been assigned for you. If you go on to law school, you'll do this all the time. You'll defend people who have done indefensible things because that's your job as a lawyer. Okay, but remember, the subjects were told in each case whether the person had a choice as to what he would write or whether it was an assignment, and then was asked to make inferences about the actual attitudes of the author. And it turned out that when people thought that the authors had a choice, this is 1967, where people actually cared about Fidel Castro, and the essays had to do with American attitudes towards the Castro regime. When people were told that the authors had a choice about what they would write, they naturally and quite logically attributed the essay to the writer's actual beliefs. But they did the same thing even when they were told that the authors had no choice about the essay they would write. Okay? So here is the fundamental attribution error. In fact, what controlled the writer's behavior in this case was something about the situation. They were assigned the topic and they were assigned the point of view, but even so, people ignored the information about situational factors and made an attribution to the person's disposition. You can see this also in the MacArthur study that I showed you before. You'll remember that one of the conditions in Leslie MacArthur's study was a control condition in which she simply gave people sentences like John laughed at the comedian with no consensus, consistency, or distinctiveness information and asked them why. And it turned out that people in this control condition tended to make inferences that John laughed at the comedian because of something about John, okay, rather than something about the situation. With no information, people should have behaved randomly. They should have given the actor, the target, the situation, and all the other combinations equal causal rating, but they didn't. They tended to attribute behavior to the actor. Okay, so again, these are just examples of the fundamental attribution errors. Skip over this. Okay, here is the definition of the actor-observer difference. Remember, we don't always attribute behavior to the actor's disposition. Sometimes we attribute it to the situation. And the claim is that we tend to attribute the behavior of other people to their personal dispositions, but the behavior, but our own behavior to the situation. The classic example that is given here is as kind of a variant on this. When your roommate fails a test, your roommate fails a test because he's stupid. When you fail a test, you fail a test because the exam was too hard. Okay? And everybody does this, right? You make a dispositional attribution about the other person, but a situational attribution about yourself. David Watson, a psychologist at the University of Iowa, reviewed a whole large number of experiments on causal attribution and noted that, in fact, people tend to make situational attributions when they're explaining their own behavior much more frequently than when they're explaining the behavior of other people. That's essentially the actor-observer difference. And then finally, the self-serving bias in causal attribution. There's a formal definition of it. This goes by a number of different names, sometimes called the ego bias, sometimes called the ego protective bias. But the general idea here is when we're explaining our own behavior, we tend to take responsibility, personal responsibility for good outcomes, and tend to deny or deflect responsibility for bad outcomes. Tony Greenwald at the University of Washington did a wonderful analysis of this in terms of traffic reports of car accidents. And when people have car accidents, they'll say things like, the stop sign was there when there never was a stop sign there before. Or in one case, very dramatic case, this tree appeared in front of me. Right? So again, accidents are bad things. We tend to deflect causal responsibility. And again, Campbell and Sedekaitis did a review of this literature and showed that, in fact, there is a tendency to engage in these self-protective biases in causal attribution. Overall, this is strength of effect, where 0.5 is a pretty big-sized effect in social science research. People tend to attribute negative outcomes to the situation, positive outcomes to themselves. This is especially the case when the domain is important, when the domain is threatening self-esteem, when the task is difficult, or when there's a lot of focus on the self. So again, conditions where there's a lot of threat to self-esteem especially tend to invoke the self-other difference in causal attribution. Okay, so again, just to bring this to an end, we do tend to use something like the covariation calculus when we can. When we can't, we fall back on other kinds of principles like causal schemata and linguistic schemata. But even when we've got all the information we need, still our causal attributions tend to be biased in various predictable ways. We tend to make the fundamental attribution error of attributing a person's behavior to his personal dispositions rather than to the situation. We do that especially for other people, okay? And for ourselves, we tend to make situational attributions about behaviors that involved negative kinds of outcomes. These are all departures from the covariation calculus, and they're all departures from the precepts of normative rationality. The question is, what do we make of this? And I'll discuss that on Wednesday. Thank you very much.